Hey there. Just wanted to spend a couple minutes really quickly introducing you to, I'm going to be honest, probably my favorite concept in AP CompGov, and I'm going to be embarrassingly honest, it's really my favorite because partly it explains a lot about the world that we live in today and all the societies that we study, and more importantly, because at heart I am like maybe 11 years old on a good day. And that concept is the idea of social cleavages. Social cleavages, you may laugh at that term in the privacy of your own home. Take this opportunity and do it as long as you want. Just don't bring that to class because that's my job. Social cleavages are internal divisions that structure societies. It's just a fancy way of describing the factors that divide us from each other within, usually for the context of this course, a country, a state. Um, According to the good folks at the College Board, we really want to focus on a few specific, a pretty short list of sources of social cleavage. One of those is socioeconomic class, so rich people versus poor people, working class people versus middle class people versus wealthy people, people with elite educations and white collar jobs versus people without elite educations and with blue collar jobs. Different ways to define that depending on the social context and the terms that you want to use, but socioeconomic class is a big source of social cleavage, of internal division. Another really big one, and living in the United States, this probably is the first thing that popped into your head, is race and ethnicity. Important for each of the societies that we study that you know what the major racial and ethnic divisions are. If there's a group that has a majority in society, it's important that you know which one that is. If there are particular marginalized racial or ethnic minorities, especially if that marginalization has political consequences or is affected by policy, you really need to know which groups those are as well. Um, a third major source is religion. What's the religious majority in a society? What's the religious minority? Are there divisions within a particular religious group in any given society? Is there a religion established as the official religion? How does the state treat people who are members of a minority religion? Maybe more importantly for these purposes, how do members of the majority religion treat people who are members of the minority religion? All of those are important questions for this course. And then finally, geography, so territory or location, the North versus the South, right? Sometimes, and when we talk about Mexico in a second, there's going to be an important North-South cleavage because proximity to the United States has important effects on the culture and on the economic opportunities in North of Mexico compared to the South, right? So geography can be a really important source of social cleavage as well. Those are the four ones that we tend to think about in this course. It is very important that if you were ever explicitly asked a question about major social cleavages in a country, that you do not say something like Democrats versus Republicans, or liberals versus conservatives, or radicals versus reactionaries, or social democrats versus liberals, or communists versus social democrats. None of that counts for our purposes in AP comparative government. In reality, in the real world, if you look around you, obviously political ideology is an important source of internal divisions. But for a course like this that focuses on politics, we actually need to exclude political ideology from our list of potential sources of social cleavage because the major question that we're going to ask is how these other sources of identity are going to influence people's political ideology and interact with political ideology and with party formation, political participation, et cetera, et cetera. So political ideology might divide people from each other in a society, but for the purposes of AP CompGov, it is not going to be, it's not going to count as a source of social cleavage if I ever ask you that question directly. One other sort of pair of vocabulary words that I want to introduce you to is a couple of different words that we use to describe the relationships between different social cleavages, because obviously there's going to be different sets of social cleavages in any given society. There's no society where the only division between people is their religion, or the only division between people is their ethnicity. Probably one of you is going to comment on the YouTube video with an exception to that, which I will welcome, but I will tell you that in the 6 countries we are studying, there's always going to be multiple sources of social cleavage. And so that means we need two different vocab words to describe the relationships between like pairs or sets of social cleavages. The first of those is reinforcing cleavages or coinciding cleavages. And those are social cleavages, sources of division that overlap with each other. I have a reinforcing cleavage if I have two or more different factors that are dividing people into the same groups. Right? So if members of an ethnic or racial minority in a country are also tend to be poorer or tend to be more working class than members of the racial or ethnic majority, then we say that race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic class are reinforcing cleavages because both of those reinforce the division between those two groups of people. If in a country I have a wealthier north and a poorer south, or vice versa, we say that geography and socioeconomic class are a reinforcing cleavage. When we get to Nigeria, you're going to have reinforcing cleavages basically everywhere you look because this is a country that's deeply ethnically divided. There is no single ethnic group that has a majority of the population. And there's this pretty strong correlation between where you live and what your ethnicity is. And so there we say that ethnicity and geography are reinforcing cleavages. And then if we layer on top of that that the north of Nigeria tends to be poorer than the south, then geography is going to reinforce those cleavages. And then if we layer on top of that Nigeria's Muslim population is concentrated in the north and its Christian population is concentrated in the south, then we have religion and geography and ethnicity and socioeconomic class layered on top of each other as reinforcing cleavages because they're all factors that divide people from one another. On the other hand, there are other pairs or sets of cleavages that we refer to as cross-cutting because they divide society into different groups based on different factors. They cut across each other, right? So if there is not a clear relationship between socioeconomic class and race or ethnicity, then socioeconomic class and race or ethnicity are cross-cutting cleavages. Cross-cutting cleavages tend to stabilize a society because they give people more in common with different members of different groups, whereas reinforcing cleavages tend to destabilize a state or a regime or the concept of a nation because they make certain groups of people feel as if they have nothing in common with large other groups of citizens of that same state. So reinforcing cleavages can be a huge source of instability and a huge challenge for any political regime to confront. And it's important that you be paying attention to every time we do regime, every time we look at constitutions or institutional structures, you want to pay attention to the ways in which those features of the constitution of the regime are designed to either minimize the destabilizing impacts of reinforcing social cleavages, or in which they might exacerbate, in which they might make worse the destabilizing effects of social cleavages, because these are major problems for any government and for any regime and for any writer of a constitution. In particular, reinforcing cleavages can be extra destabilizing. They can be most concerning from the perspective of a state that's trying to keep itself together when there's an overlap between some set of reinforcing cleavages and political ideology, because then politics becomes, as one might argue it has in the United States in the last 5 or 10 years, politics becomes not just a contest over what the government should do, but rather over what the state is and whether some group of people belongs or not in the state. So pay attention to those interactions between social relationships, social cleavages, and political activity. That's a really important theme in this course. I'm going to leave you with 2 questions to consider, which we'll come back to in class if and when we have time. One is, again, how a state or a government or a regime might try to reduce the destabilizing effects of social cleavages. How are you going to make marginalized groups feel as if they're included in your regime, included in what it means to be part of whatever country you're talking about? How are you going to prevent a majority from exercising tyrannical powers over a minority? How are you going to try and reduce the degree to which people divide themselves into political ideologies based on those other social factors, et cetera, et cetera? The other thing you want to think about is how regime type is going to influence the response to social cleavages, and in particular, how you would predict authoritarian versus democratic regimes to respond differently to those sources of division in society. All regimes try to keep themselves in power. Authoritarian and democratic regimes are going to do it differently, and so you want to be able to predict the ways in which they'll respond to social cleavages differently. That's it. We'll come back to this concept over and over again, every single case study country, and I will look forward to talking with you about social cleavages pretty soon.